From Studio 4 in the world headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, this is the News with Rick Sanchez.
Good evening. This morning, in one of the most stunning reactions this country has ever seen from Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she snapped and became extremely agitated when a reporter asked her if she hates the president. It happened as she was walking away from the podium after she had announced that the impeachment of Mr. Trump will proceed. Here it is.
Do you hate the president, Madam Speaker? Because
I don't hate anybody.
Representative Collins,
I was raised in a Catholic house. We don't hate anybody, not anybody in the world. So don't accuse me.
I did not accuse you.
You did.
I asked a question.
You did. And
Representative Collins yesterday suggested that the Democrats are doing this simply because they don't like the guy.
that has nothing to do with it. Let me just say this. This is about the Constitution of the United States and the facts that lead to the president's violation of his oath of office. And as a Catholic, I resent your using the word hate in a sentence that addresses me.
Wow. Then there's the other hot button issue that came out of the impeachment proceedings having to do with the president's son, Barron. That's coming up in our Media Muddle segment, which you do not want to miss. But we're going to begin tonight with wars and talk of more wars. The U.S. is presently engaged in wars in 7 countries. Probably less than 1% of you watching this newscast right now could name them because our media and our government prefer that you don't even know. I, not just as a journalist, but as a fellow American, believe that we should know. So here's the list of the countries where we are at war: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and Niger. By the way, we also have more than 850 military bases around the world, some of which look more like cities than bases. Why am I telling you this? Here's why. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that the Trump administration is now considering sending 14,000 U.S. soldiers and Marines to the Middle East. The report says that the contingent would also include dozens of ships and more military hardware to surround, essentially, Iran. Word is the president will make a final call on whether to send or not send any troops by the end of this month. Of course, soon after this article was making headlines, the Pentagon came out with a denial. There's really so much to chew on with this story, including the potential for an 8th war for our already overextended military, this time with Iran. And the question it behooves us to ask, right, as reporters, will a damaged, impeached president be more apt to engage militarily? Think about it. This is the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it's time to do news again. Okay, here we go. The list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. Are we really considering an escalation of troops in the Middle East again? What does ex-Navy SEAL and Governor Jesse Ventura say about the ruckus NATO summit? And a nationally syndicated columnist joins us to answer, why is the U.S. media so muddled? Once again, the saying, at least as I learned from Paco and Adela, those would be my parents, by the way, as I'm sure you probably learned from your parents as well, or your teachers, is the following: where there's smoke, there is fire. So here's the point. Just because the Pentagon is saying that it is not sending any more troops to the Middle East doesn't mean it isn't going to happen.
It's a move, if proven true, would double the number of U.S. military personnel who have been sent to the region since President Trump started building up troops back in May. But the Pentagon is already disputing the accuracy of that report. In a tweet, Pentagon Press Secretary Alyssa Ferris said, "To be clear, the reporting is wrong. The U.S. is not sending 14,000 troops to the Middle East." If this latest troop deployment does come to fruition, the troops will likely be used as a deterrent against Iranian retaliation for recent sanctions under the administration's economic pressure campaign. The U.S. has already increased its military presence in the Gulf. In the past 2 months, the DoD deployed the USS Abraham Lincoln to the Strait of Hormuz and sent additional weapons and fighter jets to Saudi Arabia, all in a show of force. But on Wednesday, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani appeared to have a change of heart. He said his country would be willing to return to the negotiating table to discuss its nuclear program, but he said that the U.S. would first need to remove all sanctions. On that same day, while meeting with U.S. Secretary Mike Pompeo in Portugal, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually called for more sanctions against Iran and said the recent unrest in that country was an opportunity to, quote, topple the regime. Pompeo echoed that sentiment.
We all know what's going on in Iran itself. These are people that are seeking freedom and a reasonable way to live, and they recognize the threat that is posed by the kleptocrats that are running the Islamic Republic of Iran. So we talked with our European partners about that and how we can together ensure that we do everything we can to create opportunity for these people who simply want freedom and the chance to live a normal life.
Last year, Trump ordered the withdrawal of 2,000 troops from northeastern Syria and agreed to leave half, all to counter Islamic State fighters and back Kurdish allies. Also ordered was 200 troops to stay behind in southern Syria to counter Iran-backed forces. This year, he again ordered a full withdrawal of the remaining 1,000 troops from Syria, then backpedaled to leave about half of those troops to help guard the Kurdish-run oil fields. And with the 2020 presidential election mounting and promises of getting troops out of foreign conflicts and avoiding potential new ones, President Trump is convinced threats his aides say Tehran poses need to be checked. For the news with Rick Sanchez, Farron Franzak, RT.
Joining us now is Danny Scherzen. He's not only a veteran who has served in Iraq and Afghanistan, he also taught at West Point. Let me ask you questions about this report from the Wall Street Journal. I'm a little troubled by this talk of 14,000 troops and who knows how many ships and how much other hardware going to what is essentially the border of Iran, while I'm watching a president who might be damaged by an impeachment process. Do you get my drift?
You know, I totally do, Rick. The president, if he's impeached or even if he's on the road to impeachment, is like a cornered animal. I mean, this is a dangerous thing because you don't necessarily know what a damaged president will do. Let's think back to Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky and how quickly cruise missiles flowed into Sudan to hit a pharmaceutical factory that was not involved with al-Qaeda and then also into the camps in Afghanistan. It worries me because unfortunately in the American body politic, war sells. And war presidents tend to, in the short term, have their publicity or their favorability rankings go way up. Up to 90% in the case of George Bush Sr., but then it kind of ended up biting him because he hadn't paid attention to domestic things like our economy. But here's the thing, right? These guys around President Trump, they're in this guy's head, and they're constantly beating that Iran drum. And, you know, after a while, any human being will succumb to that kind of pressure. Do you think that could be the case? I think it could be. You know, Trump has fired so many different policy advisors, and I'm actually glad he fired most of them. I think Mattis had to go. I'm glad Bolton's gone. But inevitably, the Washington establishment, you know, people call it the deep state. I don't like that term, I guess, but I call it the national security state. These folks have been drumming up a war with Iran for a decade and a half. And I think, and I'm no Trump supporter, as you know, although I get a lot of attacks about that, I don't think Trump actually wants war with Iran. He showed extraordinary restraint when Iran shot down our drone. But you're correct to say that the longer this is whispered in his ear, how long can we expect a man like Trump, who's not known for his self-control, to, you know, hold out before there is an attack on Iran, which of course would be disastrous. And there's one giant whisperer, right? There's one giant whisperer, if I can coin that phrase, and his name is Bibi Netanyahu. I know he's embroiled in his own problems, but I think Trump would do anything he could to help save Bibi. And this would be a helper. Would you? Do you agree? No, I do. I think that Look, Bibi and Trump are kindred spirits, okay? They both have a lot of scandal in their administrations. They're both sort of right-wing ideologues. They've got a lot in common. There is nothing that the three Bs, as I call them, Bibi Netanyahu, MBS in Saudi Arabia, and MBZ in the United Arab Emirates. There's nothing the three Bs would like more than an American strike on Iran. And here's my little rule of thumb. If Saudi Arabia and Israel agree on something, we should do the opposite. I mean, if Saudi Arabia and Israel said we should feed the hungry, I'd say let them starve. Now, I'm being facetious, but I think my point is illustrative of the reality of how dangerous these two countries are.
I think it's, you know, your statement is one that's not often heard in the media. And Danny, I'm glad we have you to share that perspective, because it's one that I think more Americans should be hearing these days with wars and talk of wars. Danny Scherzen, my thanks to you, my friend, for joining us today and sharing your insight with us.
Thanks for having me.
Meanwhile, tonight, as we look back at the NATO summit, we are left with images of very little by way of unity and a whole lot of dissension, right? Big headline is that many in the alliance may be questioning why they even exist except to propagate antiquated concerns. In fact, French President Emmanuel Macron actually said as much when he suggested the reason NATO was created is really no longer a threat.
Qui est l'ennemi?
Who is the enemy? This is the question we need to address. When the alliance was created, the answer was simple. Russia, the USSR. Things were happening that way. They changed 30 years ago. Does anyone around the table say Russia is an enemy? I do not think so.
Joining us now is Governor Jesse Ventura, governor of the great state of Minnesota, from which I hail as well. Proud to say it. Golden Gopher.
Golden Gopher.
That's right. Golden Gopher.
And I never even went there.
No, but you're just as proud to be a fan of the Golden Gopher football team.
I'm a Minnesotan, born and raised, so, you know, but I chose to go in the Navy instead of to college.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to go a little far afield from Minnesota and go into places like Europe, where the President of the United States is discussing NATO with foreign leaders. And I don't know if you've been following it, Governor, but that thing has turned into a debacle. They're arguing amongst themselves, and now they're trying to figure out, why is NATO really even necessary? Because NATO was essentially designed to keep the Russians out when it was the Soviet Union.
Yep.
Soviet Union doesn't exist. It was also designed to keep Germany down. Hitler's been dead, as last I checked, for at least a long time, and to keep the United States in. Why do we need NATO?
Wait, I'll tell you how good it is now. We just had the big thing on Normandy, right? The anniversary of Normandy. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I found very unusual?
What's that?
The Germans got invited and the Russians didn't. Now, excuse me, the Russians were our ally in World War II.
They actually won the war.
Yes, absolutely they did. Let's not pull punches.
Right.
They faced way more than we did.
26 million
and
dead.
Second of all, last time my parents fought against the Germans, and we invited them to Normandy.
It was a bit odd to see that, wasn't it? We're going to have a celebration of World War II between the Germans, the Americans, and the Brits and the French, and we're not going to invite the Russians?
Yeah, and especially for me, who both my parents are World War II veterans.
Yeah.
And my father talked about meeting the Russians in Berlin.
You can hate the Russians all you want, but in the end, you can't deny the truth.
Exactly.
And that's the point that you're making.
Exactly.
But, you know, it seems to me, I had a conversation.
Now let's get back to the...
Well, I had a conversation yesterday with Alex Mihailovich, one of our correspondents, who made the point that much of the money, whether we give it to them or NATO spends it, these billions of dollars that are spent by NATO to try and keep the world safe, most of it, whether it comes from America or doesn't come from America, comes back to America because all it's doing is feeding a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yep. We need a machine in place to continue to sell and use weapons against countries, and those countries change, but in the end, it's all about this, right?
Yeah, it's all about the military-industrial complex. It's about our U.S. economy today, which unfortunately we've allowed to become war-based. We got to have a war going on to support the military-industrial complex, which supports all these jobs in 50 states, they've done this, creating the work to continue to make weapons, and we continue to sell those weapons throughout the world. They eventually get used against our own troops down the line. They'll be shot back at us. And then the money situation's hilarious. We give money to NATO. NATO then buys the weapons from us, and essentially gives the money back to us.
It's a win-win, isn't it?
You know, yeah, it's a win-win for the military-industrial complex, and it's a lose-lose for you, the taxpayer.
And NATO now being used in places like Libya, places where governments are destabilized because we decided we're on one side and not the other side. That's not to say that we don't sometimes pick the right side, but to go around the world constantly, as we just did in Bolivia, as we did recently in Honduras, and removing democratically elected presidents or officials and leaders because we don't like them. Just
doesn't sound very American, does it?
It doesn't, right?
Yeah.
And using NATO
kind of makes you want to go take a shower as an American.
What do you mean?
Well, you feel filthy when you look at something like that. I do as a veteran. I hang my head in shame.
But that's not to say we can't, from time to time, be adventurous when it comes to helping countries around the world. My problem with it, and maybe yours too, is it seems like we don't check with Congress, we don't check with the people, the media doesn't talk about it, we don't even know when these things happen, we find out afterward. Yeah. That's what's most troubling, right?
That's the secret state that General Fletcher Prouty wrote about in his famous book. Is that our government is not run by the elected officials, it's run by the entrenched bureaucracy who they do things, and things are already moving on it to where the elected official comes in, has to accept it, otherwise they'll look stupid. How could this be happening and why didn't I know about it? Because it's already happening underneath. They learn about it late. All the elected. So this keeps going on. It doesn't matter who gets elected. The secret, as he called them, the secret team.
And this goes back to what you and I were talking about in a recent conversation. The reason a lot of these officials manifest whatever it is these giant industries want, in the biggest example, it is, in fact, the military complex that pays off most of the people in Washington, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or in the Senate or in Congress.
War is one thing you will see them in bed together on. I mean, look at right now.
But if they question it, they won't get the funds.
Who just reaffirmed the Patriot Act? The Democrats.
Yeah.
Of all people, the Democrats. So that tells you right there, when it comes to war, there's only one party.
The Green Party.
Yeah, the money party. It's called, as I like to quote the great Major General Smedley Butler, war is a racket. A two-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner.
You get very passionate about this, which is why we love to have you on. The great Jesse Ventura, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Go Minnesota. Tonight, France continues to be all but paralyzed by strikes. This thing just will not cease. This time it's workers that are protesting primarily against pension reforms. The country's transport systems have been shut down. Many schools are shut down. Rallies are taking place nationwide. We wanted to see what it was like inside these protests. And that is where we join tonight Charlotte Dubinsky.
Tensions on the streets here in Paris as this nationwide strike has turned into chaos. Some 250 protests taking part across the country with many transport networks completely paralysed. As you might get a sense from behind me, there have been clashes between the police and the protesters, with that tear gas now raining down in the city, the capital of the country. I can taste the tear gas in the air, and you might be able to hear the people shouting, "Oh, everyone hates the police." We've seen the protesters throwing projectiles towards the police, and then, of course, the police coming back at people, calling there for the demission, the resignation of President Macron. This is all over attempts to change the pension system here in France. The idea of merging some 42 separate systems into one universal system. The government says it will be fairer, it will be more equal, but people on the street say no, it won't be. It will mean that we will have to work potentially for longer. We won't have those early retirements, and our pensions at the end of this could in fact be much lower than they are. This is a very emotive subject in France, and this comes after a year of, or more than a year, of yellow vest protests. There is a general malaise here in France about the reforms being carried out by the French French administration. And as you can see, that anger is now boiling onto the streets, with this protest scheduled to last not just today, but also to roll for the next few weeks. If it does, if it brings France to a standstill over several weeks, it will match those protests back in 1995, which brought the country to a standstill. That was, in fact, the last time a French government tried to make such big changes to the pension system. People angry on the streets, and what could have been a peaceful protest has turned yet again into a big clash between the police and the protesters. Charlotte Dubinsky for RT America in Paris.
Boy, talk about being in the thick of things, huh? That's some courageous correspondent work there by Charlotte Dubinsky. Tonight, we debut a new segment. It's called the Media Muddle, because if ever the media has been muddled, or by definition in a state of disorder, it is now. Joining us, our newest RT contributor, Ruben Navarrete, who is a Harvard-educated journalist, veteran reporter, and nationally syndicated columnist. Welcome to The Muddle, Ruben.
Good to be with you, Rick.
Topic one, during the impeachment hearing yesterday, one of the witnesses mentioned the president's son while making a point. Since she did this, the conservative media immediately went into the outrage coverage, and then she went on and apologized. Here's the clips.
The Constitution says there can be no titles of nobility. So while the president can name his son Baron, he can't make him a baron. I want to apologize for what I said earlier about the president's son. It was wrong of me to do that. I wish the president would apologize, obviously, for the things that he's done that's wrong, but I do regret having said that.
The media these days tends to pay a lot of attention to moments like this, sometimes more than, I think, more important things. You say what, Ruben?
I say you're right about that. The media will take every opportunity to come out counter to Trump, so they were quick to defend this law professor for this off-color joke. It was funny to some in the moment, but clearly you can make that point lots of different ways without coming on and picking on a 13-year-old young man. So she was right to apologize, but you and I are right to point out that the media tends to get worked up over the strangest things.
Yeah, and in a case like this, really, she was trying to make a point. I mean, she very well could have said, you can buy a crown, but it doesn't make you a king. She was saying you could name your son Baron, but it certainly doesn't make him a baron. Right. I don't think it was worth the criticism that she received for it, and most of it came, by the way, from the conservative media, interestingly enough, right? Because that's the way we cover news these days.
Right. Yeah, the blue team or the red team, we're all divided up. But, it wasn't too long ago. We had 8 years of Barack Obama in the White House where Sasha and Melania were I'm sorry, it's like his other daughter. Yeah. The Obama girls were off limits, and Chelsea Clinton, when the Clintons were in the White House, was off limits. So there is kind of a sense with conservatives, they have a hair trigger when it comes to this issue. They don't want to have one standard applied to their children, another standard applied to the children of Democrats.
I think there's only one standard, what makes news and what makes me a hero with my side. And I don't think it has anything to do with news. It has everything to do with just doing ideological coverage, which is unfortunately what we get too much of these days. Let me give you another example. Last night, the cable news networks all seemed to cover the NATO summit by propping up NATO, and that's not all. Almost all of them seem to be pushing for the continuation of the war in Syria and for keeping our troops in Afghanistan. Isn't it kind of weird to you to hear news networks these days actually promoting war?
Yeah, but as your previous guest has said and as segments have talked about, that is a tradition in Washington. There's always a lot of chatter about war, and certainly politicians in both parties know the import of war when it comes to being reelected, for instance, and how it drives your poll numbers up. There's also a sense that the world gets very, very complicated. And after 9/11, we sort of had the lesson driven home to us that just because you don't think you're at war with somebody doesn't mean that somebody isn't already at war with you. So It is a very confusing area of subject where you end up with Bernie Sanders on the left and people like Donald Trump on the right in agreement to keep us out of these wars.
Here on this show, by the way, we do the opposite. We question why we are in any of these never-ending wars, and why we're not covering fomented coups in places like Honduras and Bolivia, and why the media does not cover these stories. Yet this is what was said about us last night on a show that Brian Williams does on another network with an FBI agent named Clint Watts. Listen to this.
So when you get to the end of this, it just leaves you wondering, as RT would say, question more. That is literally the headline of their news site every single day. And that method just leaves you open to this sort of doubt. And that is the entire goal of it.
He's saying question more is a bad thing.
Right. I don't get it. I don't get it. Journalism 101. Question everything, everyone, question more. You know, you're never going to get in trouble in our business for asking questions. You may get in trouble if you ask the wrong people the wrong question. You may get called in the boss's office. We've all been there. But you're supposed to be asking questions. And this segment really tells you how far off track the media has gotten, because they ask questions when they want to, when they think it's appropriate. They'll grill every member of the Trump administration. But Democrats continue to get a pass on issues like immigration, where no questions are asked.
Generally speaking, we're supposed to question the government. We're supposed to be a watchdog on the government. I can't watch Fox News or MSNBC or CNN without seeing almost nothing but government contributors and guests and panels filled with people from the CIA and the FBI and the NSA.
Right.
What is this?
Well, yes, and you see it really in both camps, right? If you tune into Fox News, the easiest way to get a contract there and become a contributor is if you say Donald Trump does nothing wrong. And if you want a contract on CNN or MSNBC, you go on and say Trump does everything wrong.
Right.
Most consumers have figured out the truth is somewhere in the middle, but you wouldn't know it from the duality of our media at the moment.
But isn't it, in the end, imperative for us to have an adversarial relationship with our government? They say, for example, that RT is controlled by the government of Russia. But when I watch the networks here in America, what do I see? It appears that they too are in bed with the government. So what's going on?
Well, they're in bed with corporations. They're in bed because they've merged together into big media companies. You never quite know who the boss is. You write the article that sort of trips a wire, and you get called in the boss's office, and you get fired. You get told you don't have a column anymore. You don't have a show anymore. It isn't until you trip the wire that you realize the wire was even there. So this idea somehow that the media companies are acting independent is crazy. It's fiction. Those of us like you and me who've been in the business for a while know that.
It was more in the past. When you studied journalism at Harvard, when I studied journalism at the University of Minnesota, there were certain ethics, certain credos that we almost swore by, that we were going to challenge the government, not be in bed with them, right?
Right. That's exactly right. We have gone off track. We need to get back on track and regain our credibility.
How did that happen, by the way? I mean, I think 9/11 probably had a lot to do with that.
It did, and so did the Trump administration, the Trump era.
Ruben Navarrete, my thanks to you, my friend. Thanks for starting off with this great series. We certainly appreciate it. That's our news. Thanks so much for being with us. If you have some friends looking for a newscast that's kind of passionate like I have just been during this conversation, tell them we're here. We'll see you again later.